Imagine a world where the sky is always gray, where the streets are lined with harsh, utilitarian buildings, and where history looms over every corner. This isn't a scene from a spy thriller or a Cold War action film. It's a glimpse into what life was truly like in the Soviet Union, behind the Iron Curtain. For decades, the West has portrayed the USSR as a land of spies, secret police, and fear, where every citizen was under constant surveillance. Movies have depicted a life of suspense and tension, with every shadow hiding a KGB agent. But the real story of life in the Soviet Union is far different from the dramatic, high-stakes narratives shown on screen. In reality, life behind the Iron Curtain was not just about constant political intrigue. It was a world of daily struggles and ordinary routines. Yes, there were shortages, lines, and the weight of living in a highly controlled society. But there were also personal stories of survival, small joys, and human connection. People woke up every day, faced incredible hardships, and still managed to carve out meaningful lives within a system that seemed designed to make that as difficult as possible. Now I want you to take a moment and picture yourself in that world. Imagine waking up in a small, shared apartment where privacy is a luxury few can afford. Picture yourself stepping out of bed, feeling the chill of the cold morning air, and preparing to face another day filled with challenges, from waiting for your turn in the shared bathroom to navigating the unpredictable public systems. This isn't a life of drama, it's a life of quiet perseverance, of finding ways to adapt, survive, and even thrive despite the odds. As you get comfortable, take a deep breath and let yourself travel back in time with me. We're going to explore the lived reality of Soviet citizens in the 1,950 seconds. We'll walk through their daily routines, understand the frustrations they faced, and discover how they found ways to cope with and sometimes push back against the system. Are you ready to step behind the Iron Curtain? Let's begin this journey together. Before we dive deeper into this story, I want to take a moment to thank you for joining me today. It means a lot that you've decided to spend your time here, listening to the untold stories of history. If you enjoy these kinds of deep dives into the past, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these stories alive and accessible to people around the world. And I'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening from? What time is it in your part of the world? Leave a comment below, and let's start a conversation about history. Now, let's journey to Leningrad, 1953, and see what daily life was really like for the millions of people who lived in the shadow of the Soviet Union. Trust me, it's going to be quite a ride. The Soviet apartment, shared and cramped. In the heart of Soviet cities, the concept of a home was far different from what we might imagine today. The typical Soviet apartment, especially in the 1,950 seconds, was not a space where one could retreat for peace and privacy. It was a place where personal space was scarce and boundaries were constantly tested. Privacy, something many of us take for granted today, was a luxury few Soviet citizens could afford. Instead, what the average Soviet family had was what could be called a shared existence, where everything from sleeping to eating, from studying to relaxing, had to be done in close proximity to others. Imagine waking up in a small, narrow room that serves as everything: a bedroom, a living room, a kitchen, and sometimes even a dining area. The room, which is shared by the entire family, is not large enough to fit even the most basic of amenities that most modern homes boast. The bed you sleep in is also the couch where guests sit, and the table you eat from is the same one you use to work, study, or socialize. Everything in this small space is multi-purpose. Your clothing hangs on hooks along the walls because there's no closet or dresser to store them. The walls are bare, with nothing more than functional furniture taking up space. The room is meant to serve all aspects of life, with little consideration for comfort or personal space. The idea of having separate rooms for each function, sleeping, eating, living, was beyond the reach of most families in the Soviet Union. This lack of private space extended to other parts of the home as well. The kitchen, for example, was often a shared space with multiple families, meaning that it wasn't uncommon for people to have to wait for their turn to cook, wash dishes, or even store food. Families had a designated shelf in the fridge and a spot in the cabinets, but there was never enough room to store more than the bare essentials. Cooking appliances were often shared too, and in some cases, families even built makeshift stoves to avoid the conflicts that arose over shared cooking times. The challenge of coordinating meals, doing the dishes, and preparing food while respecting other family schedules became a daily task, requiring patience and constant negotiation. And then there's the bathroom, often shared by several families, sometimes as many as 8 or more. It was not uncommon for people to have to wait in line for the bathroom, carefully timing their morning routine to avoid running late for work or school. For many, this daily ritual was an exercise in coordination and compromise. Each family might only have a few minutes in the bathroom before someone else needed to use it. The lack of hot water was another issue, and showers were often brief and cold, especially in the winter months when the weather outside was freezing. The shared bathroom became a place where one could encounter not only the inconvenience of waiting, but also the noise and chaos of the other families using the same space. The walls of these apartments were thick, often built with old pre-revolutionary bricks, but the doors were thin, and sound carried easily. The resulting lack of privacy was felt in nearly every aspect of daily life. Living in such cramped conditions meant that the concept of personal space became almost non-existent. Even sleep was something shared. Parents slept on fold-out beds or in makeshift sleeping arrangements, and children often shared beds with siblings or, in some cases, with parents themselves. The lack of a dedicated space for each family member created a culture where people were constantly aware of each other's presence. In such close quarters, every action, every word, was heard by someone else. This created an environment where every family member's routines were inextricably tied to the schedules of their neighbors and relatives. Despite these challenges, the lack of personal space also fostered a deep sense of community. With such limited resources, families learned to rely on each other, creating informal networks of support. In a society where official resources were often in short supply, neighbors became a vital source of help, whether it was sharing food, helping each other with repairs, or just offering a kind word in times of hardship. The bonds between families were crucial to surviving the daily grind. This close-knit, often intrusive lifestyle also meant that social connections were at the center of everyday life. People knew each other's business whether they liked it or not, and this created a unique sense of shared experience, even among complete strangers. The shared, cramped living conditions of Soviet apartments may seem like a harsh way to live, but it was the reality for millions. The government's emphasis on communal living was rooted in socialist ideals of resource sharing and equality. But the practical consequences often made life more difficult, not easier. Yet, in the midst of this hardship, people found ways to create lives full of meaning. Small acts of kindness, shared meals, and the quiet resilience of families made these spaces more than just physical structures. They were places where people found ways to survive, to adapt, and sometimes to thrive. The Soviet apartment, with its lack of privacy and personal space, became a reflection of a society that prioritized collective need over individual comfort. In these shared, cramped spaces, people forged relationships and built a sense of community that was deeply interwoven with their daily lives. Despite the limitations, these apartments were not just places of hardship, but also of connection, survival, and human resilience. In the end, the Soviet apartment became a symbol of the strength of its people, their ability to endure, to adapt, and to find solidarity in the most challenging of circumstances. The morning routine, a test of patience. Mornings in Soviet communal apartments were far from the tranquil and efficient routines that many of us are used to. Instead, they were a battleground of small, daily struggles, each family vying for their turn in the shared spaces that were critical to their day. In a system where privacy was virtually non-existent and personal time was in constant competition with others, the morning routine became an intricate, carefully choreographed series of negotiations. The shared bathroom, kitchen, and other common areas were not just spaces, they were the stages of a high-stakes performance where timing, patience, and respect for the unwritten rules were key. For many families in the Soviet Union, the bathroom was the first test of patience every morning. Unlike modern homes with multiple bathrooms, the typical Soviet communal apartment had only one bathroom per floor, shared by several families. This created a kind of unspoken bathroom diplomacy, where every family had to be aware of their neighbors' schedules and follow a strict, if unofficial, time frame to avoid conflict. In these apartments, the first rule was clear. Timing was everything. There was no official schedule, no bulletin board with neatly written times, just a tacit understanding that everyone would follow an unspoken rhythm. For example, it was common for the family with the earliest work or school commitments to get the bathroom first. This meant that if you had a 9 a.m. meeting, you needed to be up by 6 a.m. to claim your spot in line. But getting up too early was also problematic. The water might be cold, and the discomfort of waiting could add to the already stressful start to the day. Each family member knew their place in the queue. Some might get only a few minutes in the bathroom to brush their teeth, wash their face, and possibly shower, while others had to make do with only enough time to splash cold water on their faces and rush out. The unwritten bathroom schedule was a survival tactic. Families learned to anticipate the needs of others and adjust their own routines accordingly. Taking too long, or using the bathroom without considering your neighbor's needs, was considered inconsiderate and could lead to tension or even conflict. While the bathroom might have been the first test of patience, the kitchen was where the real logistical challenges unfolded. The kitchen in a Soviet communal apartment was not a space for leisurely cooking or enjoying family meals. It was a shared area where every family had its own shelf in the refrigerator, its own cabinet for dry goods, and, if they were lucky, a burner on the shared stove. With multiple families cooking at the same time, the kitchen became a place of intense coordination. The kitchen schedule, like the bathroom schedule, was unspoken but crucial. You couldn't just cook whenever you felt like it. For a family of 5, getting breakfast ready for the day, whether it was tea, porridge, or eggs, required strategic planning. There were few appliances available, so the stove was a shared resource. With only 1 or 2 burners available, families had to time their cooking carefully. If someone was already using the stove, you had to wait your turn, and waiting meant being efficient. No one had the luxury of leisurely cooking. Each person was aware of how much time they had and how much they needed to get done before their turn ran out. The refrigerator was another challenge. Shared storage meant that food had to be carefully rationed, and each family had their own section to store whatever they could afford to buy. However, because supplies were often scarce, families couldn't stock up on extra food. Shopping was an unpredictable event, and the contents of the fridge often had to be divided evenly among families, with everyone hoping for their fair share. This meant that every meal, from preparing breakfast to making dinner, became an exercise in coordination. If you were planning to cook rice, but another family had already planned to use the stove for their evening soup, you might have to delay your meal or compromise on what you were preparing. In some cases, Families went even further to avoid conflicts in the kitchen. Some would install their own portable burners in the corners of the kitchen to avoid competing with neighbors for cooking space. This was a practical, yet unofficial solution to the problem of shared space. It wasn't unusual for a family to hoard food or equipment that they knew would be in short supply, making sure they were prepared for days when resources were limited. The key to surviving the morning routine in a Soviet communal apartment was understanding and respecting the unwritten rules, or kitak ungum. These invisible codes were a set of shared, though informal, guidelines that dictated how residents would interact with one another in the common spaces. These rules were not written down anywhere. They were learned through experience, passed from one family member to another, and were sometimes reinforced through small, everyday acts of courtesy or through conflicts that made everyone more conscious of the rules. The rules varied from apartment to apartment, but some general principles applied universally. The most important was the need to respect each other's time and space. The bathroom schedule, for instance, was not just a matter of timing, it was about acknowledging that everyone had their own needs and obligations. If you were running late, it was understood that you should hurry and not take more than your fair share of time. A family member who took too long in the bathroom was often considered inconsiderate, as it could mess up the whole schedule for everyone else. In extreme cases, families would negotiate these rules more directly, with one family member kindly asking another to speed up or to take their turn later. The kitchen, too, had its own set of rules. It was expected that each family would clean up after themselves, and there was an unspoken agreement to avoid making too much noise or disturbing the others while cooking. But above all, it was crucial not to waste resources. With food and supplies often in short supply, families had to be resourceful and share what they had. If a neighbor needed a bit of salt, some bread, a cup of milk, it was considered normal to offer it, especially when they were in need. But these rules were not always followed. In some cases, they were bent or ignored, leading to frustration. For example, if one family failed to follow the unwritten rule of cleaning up the kitchen after using it, it could lead to an impromptu confrontation. These conflicts were usually resolved quickly, as everyone knew that cooperation was essential to maintaining peace in the apartment. However, even the smallest breaches of these unspoken rules could lead to tension and unease between neighbors. In these communal living spaces, the daily morning routine was not just about preparing for the day ahead, it was about managing relationships, respecting the needs of others, and navigating a system where personal comfort and privacy were limited. The bathroom, the kitchen, and the shared hallways were not just functional spaces, they were the battlegrounds where the rhythm of daily life played out. Each family's ability to adhere to these invisible codes of conduct determined their success in getting through the day without unnecessary conflict. Shared spaces. The challenges of communal living. Living in a Soviet communal apartment meant that every aspect of daily life was intertwined with that of your neighbors. Privacy, in the traditional sense, was almost non-existent, and personal space was a luxury few could afford. The concept of shared spaces was not just about communal areas such as the kitchen, bathroom, and hallway. It extended to almost every aspect of the apartment itself, where families had to coexist in the tightest of quarters. The kitchen was often the heart of the communal apartment, but it was also one of the most contentious spaces. In these apartments, the kitchen wasn't just a place to prepare meals, it was a shared battleground for time, space, and resources. There were no private stoves, refrigerators, or storage areas for each family. Instead, each family had to make do with a shared kitchen, where the appliances were often in short supply or in disrepair, and every family had to manage their turn to use the stove, oven, or even the sink. Families stored their food on designated shelves in the refrigerator, But even the refrigerator was a limited resource. There wasn't much room, so every family had to ration their food carefully. It wasn't uncommon to find one family hoarding food in case of a shortage, or even to borrow a little extra from their neighbors when supplies ran low. Cooking time was another challenge. With multiple families vying for limited cooking space, the kitchen often became a place of quiet, or not so quiet, negotiation. When one family needed to cook a large meal or prepare food for the entire day, they had to carefully plan their time so as not to disrupt the rhythm of the other families. But even with the constant frustration of shared cooking spaces, the kitchen also provided opportunities for cooperation. It wasn't unusual for neighbors to help each other out by sharing food or cooking together, especially in times of scarcity. In this way, the communal kitchen became both a site of tension and a place where bonds were formed through shared struggles. The bathroom was another critical shared space in Soviet communal apartments, and for many families, it was a daily test of patience. With several families using the same bathroom, timing became crucial. The bathroom was often cramped, with just enough space for one person to use it at a time. With no private bathrooms, people had to wait their turn, and mornings could quickly become a frantic race to get in and out before it was too late. There was no guaranteed hot water, and the plumbing was often old and unreliable. Families had to learn to navigate these conditions, managing their time carefully to ensure they wouldn't miss their turn. Waiting in line for the bathroom was a common occurrence, and negotiating this shared space became an important part of everyday life. It was also one of the most stressful parts of communal living, especially when there were conflicts over bathroom time or when someone took too long in the bathroom. Despite these challenges, the shared bathroom also created opportunities for socializing. People often exchanged small pleasantries while waiting in line, or offered advice on how to manage the long lines. Even though privacy was limited, these shared experiences helped build a sense of community among neighbors. While the kitchen and bathroom were the most functional shared spaces, the hallways in these apartments played an important role as well. Often narrow and dimly lit, the hallways were where families passed each other as they moved about their daily routines. These hallways were not private spaces, they were shared pathways used by everyone in the apartment. The narrow hallways often felt crowded and impersonal, but they were also the spaces where residents interacted, whether by exchanging quick greetings, holding brief conversations, or simply bumping into each other on their way to the bathroom or kitchen. These interactions, though often brief and fleeting, were an important part of communal life. In a society where privacy was scarce, the hallway became one of the few places where neighbors could connect, however briefly. The most striking feature of these shared spaces was the unspoken set of rules that governed how everyone lived together. These rules, passed down from one generation to the next, were not written down anywhere but were followed by everyone who lived in the apartment. They were a set of house rules that were understood, even if never discussed aloud. For example, when it came to the kitchen, everyone knew that you didn't hog the stove for too long, and that you had to be quick and efficient when cooking. You didn't leave your dishes in the sink for others to clean up, and you didn't take more than your fair share of food from the fridge. In the bathroom, there was an understanding that each family had a right to their time, but you had to respect the needs of others. If you took too long, you risked angering your neighbors, which could lead to unnecessary tensions. These unwritten rules weren't just about fairness, they were about survival in a crowded, often tense environment. Living in such close quarters meant that everyone's behavior affected everyone else's daily life. A minor inconvenience for one person could become a major problem for everyone if it disrupted the delicate balance of shared resources. Living in such a confined and controlled environment also had a psychological impact on residents. The constant proximity to others, with little opportunity for private reflection or personal space, could lead to feelings of frustration, isolation, and even resentment. The lack of privacy was especially difficult for children, who often had to grow up in a space where their every move was watched by others. At the same time, the shared spaces of the apartment complex also fostered a sense of solidarity and mutual dependence. Families often relied on each other to get by, whether it was sharing food during times of shortage, helping with repairs, or offering emotional support during difficult times. The communal nature of the apartment created bonds between families, which, despite the inevitable tensions, provided a sense of unity. In the end, the shared spaces in a Soviet communal apartment weren't just about the physical challenges of living together, they were a reflection of the collective society itself. The constant negotiations for time and space mirrored the larger dynamics of Soviet life, where resources were limited and individuals had to work together to survive. Living in a communal apartment meant that personal desires had to be put aside for the good of the collective. Whether in the kitchen, the bathroom, or the hallways, every interaction in these shared spaces was an opportunity to practice cooperation, compromise, and patience. These shared spaces, though often frustrating and uncomfortable, were also where people formed connections, developed resilience, and adapted to the limitations of their environment. They were a testament to the strength of the human spirit, able to thrive even in the most challenging of circumstances. Despite the challenges, people learned to make the most of the shared spaces in their apartments, finding ways to coexist peacefully, even when everything around them seemed to be in short supply. The cold mornings. Waking up in the Soviet winter. Waking up on a cold Soviet winter morning was a stark contrast to the warmth and comfort many of us are accustomed to. In the 1,950 seconds and beyond, central heating in Soviet apartments was a luxury that was often unreliable, especially in older buildings. For many Soviet citizens, mornings during the winter months meant more than just a chill in the air. It was a daily struggle to stay warm in apartments that were, at best, poorly insulated and, at worst, freezing cold. The moment you opened your eyes in the morning, you could feel the biting cold of the air surrounding you. Central heating, which was supposed to be a standard feature of Soviet apartment buildings, often left much to be desired. Even when the system was working, the heat was inconsistent, and there was no guarantee it would turn on in the early hours of the morning when you needed it most. On some mornings, you would wake up to find that your breath was visible in the air, like a cloud of steam hanging in front of your face. The thin blanket that barely kept you warm at night now seemed inadequate for the harsh chill that had settled in the room. There was no escape from the cold, especially in the early hours before the sun had risen. As you sat up in bed, you could feel the sharpness of the cold floor beneath your feet, the thin carpet doing little to protect against the biting chill from the concrete beneath. The draft from the windows, which were often old and leaky, seemed to seep through the cracks and crevices, making every room feel like a mini icebox. The cold was pervasive and relentless, an ever-present companion that accompanied you throughout the winter months. To survive the cold mornings, families had to rely on every available layer of clothing. You would start your day by bundling up as best as you could, putting on thick socks, a sweater, and the warmest jacket you could find. For many, the warmth of their bed was the only thing that kept them from freezing. But as soon as it was time to get up, the race to dress quickly and get moving was on. You pulled on your coat even inside the apartment, knowing it would be a while before you could warm up. A cold room was only part of the battle. The central heating was a hit or miss affair. It wasn't unusual to find the radiators lukewarm, or worse, completely cold. The lack of reliable heating meant that Soviet families had to get creative to stay warm. Many would sleep in layers of clothing, adding extra blankets to their beds. and sometimes even wrapping themselves in coats or heavy scarves while they slept. The living room was often a makeshift haven of warmth, with families gathering around the stove or the kitchen to make hot tea, coffee, or soup to help stave off the chill. The Soviet version of a cozy morning often involved all the family members huddling together, wrapped in layers of clothing and blankets, trying to make the best of the situation. The kitchen, with its small electric or gas stove, was not only a place for cooking but also a space for warmth, where people would gather to drink their hot beverages and try to stay warm until the heating system kicked in, if it ever did. The daily struggle to stay warm was not just physically uncomfortable, it was mentally draining as well. The constant battle against the cold became a part of everyday life, affecting not only the mornings but also the mood and energy levels of individuals. For many, it was difficult to get out of bed and start the day when the room was freezing, and even more so when the heat wasn't working. The cold had a way of sapping your energy, making every movement feel sluggish and more difficult than it should be. The lack of warmth and the struggle to maintain comfort contributed to a sense of fatigue that hung over the Soviet winter months. On days when the central heating system was particularly unreliable, people learned to adapt in any way they could by wearing more layers, keeping extra blankets on hand, and finding ways to conserve heat. There were even reports of people using makeshift heating methods, such as small electric heaters or stoves, that were not always the safest options. But despite the discomfort and the weariness of cold mornings, the resilience of the Soviet people was remarkable. The harsh winter conditions were just another part of life that had to be endured. People became experts in dealing with the cold, learning how to adapt, make do, and still carry on with their daily routines. For many, surviving the cold was a matter of routine perseverance, and the struggle to stay warm was simply part of the resilience required to live in a system that prioritized collective needs over personal comfort. In Soviet apartments, the cold wasn't just something you endured in the early morning hours. It was a pervasive force that affected nearly every aspect of life during the winter. In the kitchen, bathrooms, and hallways, the chill never really left. Even when the heating system was functioning, the warmth rarely reached every corner of the apartment. The central heating was notorious for being inconsistent, and there was often no guarantee that the radiators would provide sufficient warmth. The heating might work in the middle of the night, waking you up with stifling warmth, or it might come on only in short bursts during the day, leaving the apartment cold for long stretches of time. In the mornings, the living room, hallway, and kitchen remained chilly, and it wasn't unusual for families to wear their coats indoors while they went about their routines. The bedrooms, often located at the farthest corners of the apartment, were the coldest of all. In many cases, the heat didn't reach these areas at all, and families would resort to layering on extra blankets to stay warm at night. Despite these efforts, the mornings were always a test of endurance. You'd wake up to the stark reality of a cold room, and it was almost impossible to avoid feeling the effects of the cold as you moved through the apartment. While families adapted to the cold by wearing multiple layers and using makeshift heaters, like small electric fans or hot water bottles, it was clear that the cold never fully left. The dampness from the concrete floors, the chill in the air, and the unreliable heating system meant that many families faced the challenge of surviving the winter in ways that were less about comfort and more about sheer survival. It wasn't uncommon to find people huddled around stoves or small electric heaters, trying to warm up before they had to venture out into the colder parts of the apartment. Even the most resilient families found themselves affected by this persistent cold. It became a part of daily life, an uninvited companion that influenced moods, productivity, and overall well-being. The lack of reliable warmth in these communal spaces was a constant reminder of the hardships that residents faced. It wasn't just about physical discomfort. The cold had a psychological impact too. The gray, cold mornings and the relentless battle to stay warm left many people feeling drained before the day even began. And yet, even with the unrelenting cold, people adapted. They made the best of the situation, building small routines around the discomfort, wearing layers of clothes indoors, and managing their time around the uncertain heating schedule. The cold never fully disappeared, but it became something that people learned to live with. It was an ever-present reminder of the tough, sometimes grim conditions of life in the Soviet Union, but it also symbolized the resilience of those who lived through it. Surviving the cold became not only a daily physical challenge, but also a symbol of endurance and adaptability within the context of Soviet life. The battle against the cold was representative of the larger struggles that Soviet citizens faced on a daily basis: constant hardships, limited resources, and an unpredictable environment. But it was also a testament to the resilience and resourcefulness of the people who lived through these conditions. In many ways, enduring the cold in the Soviet Union was a microcosm of the broader experience of life under a centralized, state-controlled system. The cold represented more than just a physical discomfort. It was a daily reminder of the inefficiencies and inadequacies of the system, where basic necessities like reliable heating were often unreliable. The cold reminded people that even in the midst of a supposedly thriving socialist state, there were often glaring gaps in the quality of life. But it also represented something else: the strength of the human spirit. Despite the discomfort, people found ways to adapt. They knew that waiting for the heat to come on was futile, so they learned to layer their clothing, use space heaters, and make do with what little they had. Over time, these small adaptations became part of daily life, and they gave people a sense of agency in an otherwise rigid system. Living in the cold was also a way of enduring and maintaining hope through hardship. For many people, facing the cold every winter became a shared experience, one that brought families together and forged a sense of camaraderie among neighbors. The harsh conditions were endured together, and in that shared struggle, there was solidarity. In a way, surviving the cold became a rite of passage for every Soviet citizen, something that everyone could relate to, regardless of their background or status. The resilience required to endure the cold also mirrored the endurance required to navigate life within the Soviet system itself. Much like the struggle to keep warm in an apartment with unreliable heating, life in the Soviet Union required a great deal of patience, persistence, and flexibility. People learned to manage within the confines of what they were given, finding ways to make the system work for them, even when it often didn't work in their favor. In this sense, the cold was not just a physical reality, it was a metaphor for the larger system people were living within. It was uncomfortable, unpredictable, and often harsh, but it was something that people had no choice but to adapt to. The ability to endure the cold became a symbol of the Soviet people's strength and perseverance, a testament to their ability to keep moving forward, even in the face of difficult and often uncomfortable circumstances. As much as the cold served as a reminder of the flaws and shortcomings of the Soviet system, it also revealed the enduring spirit of the people who lived through it. The cold, much like the political system itself, could never be fully escaped. But through resourcefulness, adaptability, and sheer determination, Soviet citizens learned to live with it and even thrive in spite of it. It was this resilience that defined much of Soviet life, as people found ways to carry on, endure, and make the best of a challenging and often unforgiving reality. The battle for bathroom time. In the Soviet communal apartments, one of the most challenging aspects of daily life was navigating the shared bathroom. With multiple families living in the same space, getting access to the bathroom was a carefully choreographed process, often involving long waits, strict time limits, and the delicate balancing of personal needs with those of your neighbors. For many, The bathroom was more than just a place to get ready in the morning. It was the site of one of the most intense daily battles for space and time. Unlike modern homes, where a bathroom is often a personal space available whenever needed, in a Soviet communal apartment, access to the bathroom was strictly limited. Each family had roughly 15 minutes of bathroom time, a rule that was unwritten but understood by everyone. This strict time frame wasn't just for the sake of efficiency, it was a survival tactic. With limited access to the bathroom and multiple families needing to use it at different times, these 15-minute intervals were the only way to ensure everyone could get their turn. The 15-minute window was usually all you had, whether you needed to brush your teeth, take a shower, or simply splash some water on your face. For many, it wasn't just a matter of fitting in their morning hygiene routine, it was about getting ready for work or school. And failing to manage your time properly could mean being late. The pressure to get everything done quickly within that short time frame often led to a frantic rush as soon as the bathroom became available. Getting access to the bathroom was no easy task, as there were usually multiple families sharing one bathroom. Waiting in line was a daily occurrence. The line often started to form early in the morning, long before the first person in line could get to the bathroom. As families began to wake up, the morning routine became a race against time. Who would get there first? Who would finish in time to avoid inconveniencing the others? The first person up in the morning was often the one with the most control over bathroom time. If you were the first to arrive at the bathroom, you would have the luxury of a relatively quiet and quick start to your morning routine. However, as the minutes ticked by and more people joined the line, the wait became longer, and the pressure to finish your business before the time was up mounted. Families were expected to respect the rules about bathroom time. If you were running late, you would have to skip your shower or rush through brushing your teeth. The bathroom became a space not only for personal care, but also for strategy, as families planned their schedules around the fixed time limits. This routine wasn't just about getting ready, it was about being disciplined and efficient, and working within the constraints imposed by the communal living environment. As much as the 15-minute rule was strictly followed, there were still some unofficial rules that made this process more manageable. The most important of these was the silent understanding of when it was acceptable to take a bit longer. Sometimes, neighbors would help each other by making quick adjustments to the schedule. For example, if you needed a little extra time, you might try to signal to the person waiting behind you that you would be finished soon, or you might even cut your routine short to avoid causing delays. These subtle negotiations were a way of maintaining peace in a shared space, and they helped reduce the tension that could arise from a rushed and uncomfortable morning. In some cases, the bathroom schedule wasn't adhered to strictly, especially when one family had a young child, an elderly member, or someone sick. Neighbors would understand that a family with such needs might require more than 15 minutes to get ready, and they would let them take extra time as long as everyone else agreed. These small acts of kindness, though rare, created a sense of solidarity among families, even in the most uncomfortable of living situations. The daily battle for bathroom time was not just a logistical challenge, it was also a test of patience, discipline, and diplomacy. The constant negotiation over shared spaces wore on people mentally and emotionally. For children, the routine was particularly difficult. Many children would be woken up early to get their turn in the bathroom before heading to school. The rush to get dressed, use the bathroom, and get ready in time added stress to what should have been a simple routine. Even for adults, the stress of waiting in line, often in cold or uncomfortable conditions, took a toll. The psychological impact of living in such close quarters, with little control over the basic aspects of daily life like bathroom access, contributed to the overall sense of tension in communal living. There was a constant sense of urgency and anxiety about managing time, and small delays could result in feelings of frustration and even resentment. Yet, over time, most people adapted to this reality, learning to cope with the constraints of communal living by developing their own strategies for maintaining peace and order. The bathroom in these communal apartments wasn't just a functional space, it was also one of the few places where a small measure of privacy could be found. In the absence of private bedrooms or personal space, the bathroom became an oasis of solitude. Even though it was shared, many people treasured their 15 minutes of time alone in the bathroom, where they could close the door, escape the noise of a crowded apartment, and have a few quiet moments to themselves. This small slice of privacy was something many residents cherished, despite the stress of having to share the space with others. In a society where personal boundaries were often blurred by the close quarters of communal living, the bathroom served as a place of psychological refuge, even if only for a short time. It was a reminder of the little things that could provide a sense of personal dignity, even in the midst of the broader challenges of Soviet life. The daily battle for bathroom time was, in many ways, a microcosm of life in the Soviet Union. It was a struggle for space, a negotiation of resources, and an exercise in patience and compromise. The bathroom, like many other shared spaces, was not just about functionality, it was a place where social dynamics played out. It reflected the tension between individual needs and collective living, and the ways in which people adapted to the constraints of their environment. In the end, the battle for bathroom time was a small but significant part of the broader Soviet experience. It was a reminder of the challenges of communal living, and the ways in which individuals learn to navigate the limitations of their environment. Despite the inconvenience and frustration, the people living in these conditions found ways to survive, adapt, and even build small moments of peace and solidarity in the most unlikely of places. The community kitchen, survival through cooperation. In Soviet communal apartments, the kitchen was not just a space for cooking, it was a critical battleground for survival. With multiple families sharing a single kitchen, it quickly became apparent that cooperation, patience, and adaptability were necessary to make it work. For many, the kitchen was a space of both camaraderie and tension, where the simple act of preparing food for the day could turn into a complex exercise in negotiation. The kitchen in these communal apartments was typically equipped with only a few basic resources, which meant that families had to carefully coordinate their use. Each family had a small designated section in the refrigerator where they could store their food, but the shared space meant that storage was minimal and often overcrowded. Items like milk, bread, and butter had to be carefully rationed, and families learned to make do with what little they had. Access to the stove was similarly limited. In most kitchens, there was only one gas stove shared by all the families. While each family typically had its own burner on the stove, the reality of sharing the kitchen meant that there was always a certain amount of waiting involved. Cooking a meal wasn't as simple as just turning on the burner and getting to work. Instead, families had to plan their cooking times around each other's schedules. There was a constant negotiation for space, time, and resources as each family tried to cook without interrupting the others. Families learned to develop an unspoken system for when and how to use the kitchen, with each member understanding the need to respect other families' cooking schedules. Early risers often got the advantage of a quiet kitchen, while late sleepers had to rush to prepare meals amidst the bustle of other families preparing their own food. If one family needed to use the stove for a longer period of time, they might ask others to wait or to make do with smaller cooking spaces, creating a delicate balance of cooperation and compromise. To avoid chaos, many families devised informal systems to manage their cooking schedules. One of the most common solutions was the creation of a shared timetable, a set of unwritten rules that regulated who could cook and when. These schedules were based on necessity and practicality. Families that worked early shifts were usually allowed to cook first, while families with more flexible schedules had to adjust. The schedule often extended beyond just cooking. Families would also have to coordinate when to clean up and when they could access shared items like pots, pans, or kitchen utensils. The most important unspoken rule was the need to clean up after yourself. If you left dishes in the sink or cluttered the countertops, it could cause frustration among neighbors. In the absence of personal space and privacy, the kitchen became a reflection of how well families could cooperate and live harmoniously in close quarters. Those who didn't follow the rules could find themselves in a difficult position, as tensions could easily build up in such a communal space. While there was always a sense of urgency to get meals prepared quickly, especially during busy periods like breakfast or dinner, the kitchen also provided opportunities for interaction and community. For many families, meal preparation was a shared activity, where neighbors would talk about their day, exchange recipes, and even share food. In a system where scarcity was common, the act of sharing food, especially in the face of shortages, became a symbolic act of solidarity. Despite the benefits of cooperation, the shared kitchen was also a source of constant friction. Cooking in close proximity to others meant that people's habits and cooking styles often clashed. Some families had children who needed their food prepared at specific times, while others had members who worked long hours and needed to cook meals at irregular hours. The close quarters and lack of privacy meant that even small differences could lead to arguments or resentment. It wasn't uncommon for disputes to arise over something as simple as who had the right to use the stove first or who would be able to cook on a particular burner. These tensions were often exacerbated by the fact that many families had to rely on the kitchen for more than just cooking. They had to use it for storage, cleaning, and sometimes even for socializing. For example, during cold winters when other parts of the apartment were freezing, the kitchen became a warming space where families would gather to drink tea or share news. The limited space, combined with the shared resources, made it challenging for families to enjoy a peaceful and quiet meal. However, even with these challenges, the shared kitchen also created a sense of community. The daily act of cooking and sharing a space with others, despite the inconveniences, became a necessary part of life. Over time, families learned to navigate the delicate balance of respecting each other's space and schedules while finding ways to make the most of what little they had. The communal kitchen, with its shared resources and unwritten rules, was a microcosm of Soviet life itself, a place where cooperation was necessary for survival and where resources were limited but shared. It represented the balance between individual needs and collective living, as each family adjusted to make the most of the space and resources available to them. Despite the daily struggles, the kitchen also embodied the resilience of the Soviet people, able to adapt, compromise, and find a way to live and thrive in a system marked by scarcity and uncertainty. In the end, the community kitchen wasn't just about food, it was about survival through cooperation. It was a space where, despite the difficulties, people found ways to make the best of the situation, forming relationships, learning to adapt to the system, and enduring the challenges of communal living with dignity. Through shared meals and shared spaces, Soviet families were able to come together, survive, and carry on just as they did in many other areas of their lives. The breadline. Daily struggles for basics. In the Soviet Union, something as simple as buying a loaf of bread was far from a straightforward task. The breadline, a daily fixture in many cities, represented not just the scarcity of goods but also the broader struggles faced by citizens trying to obtain even the most basic necessities. Despite the system of state-controlled distribution designed to ensure that everyone had access to basic food items, such as bread, the reality was often much more complicated. Under the Soviet system, bread was one of the key staple foods, heavily subsidized by the government as part of the state's plan to provide affordable and essential items to its citizens. The idea was that no matter how limited the economic resources were, bread would remain available for all. But the state's promise of providing enough for everyone did not always align with reality. While the government kept prices low and accessible, the central planning system often failed to produce the necessary supply to meet the demand. There were times when even bread, the most basic of foods, was in short supply. This gap between the promises of the system and the reality of shortages led to long lines outside bakeries, grocery stores, and other food distribution points. These lines weren't just an occasional inconvenience, they were a daily part of life. Every morning, citizens would gather in line, often before the stores opened, hoping that there would be enough bread to go around. The lines were never short, and the wait could sometimes stretch on for hours, especially in colder months when people would stand outside for extended periods, bundled up in heavy coats and scarves, just to ensure they could get their ration of bread. For many families, the bread line was a daily ritual. It wasn't just about the food, it was about survival. Getting bread often meant getting up early to secure a spot in line before others. You had to be strategic. If you were late, you risked walking away empty-handed or only with a small amount of bread, which wasn't enough to feed a family for the day. As a result, many people adjusted their daily schedules around this essential task, waking up earlier to join the queue, often before even starting their workday or school day. This daily struggle was not without its frustrations. The uncertainty of whether you'd actually get any bread, let alone enough to feed your family, was a constant source of stress. Even if you managed to get in line early, there was no guarantee that the store would have bread in stock when you reached the counter. Sometimes, when the bakery ran out of bread, there were no other options, and families would have to make do with whatever other food was available, which was often limited. Many had to learn to be creative in the kitchen, making meals with the little they had or relying on other staple foods like potatoes, cabbage, or buckwheat. Despite the frustration and hardship, the bread line also had a strange sense of community. Standing in line, sometimes for hours, people had little else to do but talk. In the absence of privacy and personal space, the bread line became a place where neighbors would exchange news, discuss local gossip, and even share tips about where the best bread might be available on a given day. For those who were lucky enough to make it through the line, it wasn't just the bread they were bringing home, it was a feeling of accomplishment, of having survived the daily struggle to get by. Sometimes, the line would turn into a sort of informal support network. If a neighbor was sick, they might ask someone to hold their place in line. Older citizens, who could struggle to stand for long periods of time, might receive help from others who would let them cut in line or hold their place. There was a sense of shared experience, as everyone in the line understood the difficulty of the task. Even though these moments were often fleeting, they helped to foster a sense of solidarity, where people who didn't know each other personally could still work together to ensure that everyone had access to the essentials. However, not everyone was so lucky. The reality of shortages meant that some people would leave the bread lines empty-handed, and the sight of disappointed faces was common. The lines were also a reminder of how essential and yet how fragile the Soviet food system was. The daily bread line wasn't just about getting food, it was about navigating a system that was supposed to ensure fairness, but often led to uneven access to resources. The bread line wasn't just a routine, It was a symbol of the broader challenges of living under the Soviet system. Despite the government's claims of providing for all its citizens, the reality was often marked by inefficiency, shortages, and long waits for the most basic items. The bread line, as frustrating and inconvenient as it was, became a place where individuals had to adjust to the limitations of the system. The daily ritual of waiting for bread was a reminder of the unpredictability of life in the Soviet Union, where even essential items could be subject to rationing and where access to food and goods was often determined by luck, timing, and the ability to endure long queues. The daily struggle for bread also highlighted the division between the ideals of socialism and the lived experiences of its citizens. On one hand, the government promised equality, ensuring that no one would go hungry. But on the other hand, the reality of scarcity exposed the cracks in the system, where access to basic resources became a competitive, sometimes even combative, task. The breadline was a microcosm of Soviet life itself, one where individuals had to endure inefficiencies, shortages, and a system that often failed to deliver on its promises. For those living in Soviet communal apartments, the breadline was just one of many daily challenges. Yet, despite the long waits and frequent shortages, people learned to adapt and survive. The breadline was more than just a place to get food, it was a place of endurance, solidarity, and a reminder of the everyday struggles that defined life in the Soviet Union. Whether you were first in line or last, the breadline was something that everyone had to navigate, a shared experience that shaped the collective consciousness of Soviet citizens. And in the end, it was through these daily struggles, both big and small, that people were able to endure the difficulties of life in the Soviet system. Work life in the factory, the engine of the Soviet economy. In the heart of the Soviet economy lay the factories, the industrial powerhouses that were seen as the backbone of the socialist state. For millions of Soviet citizens, life was built around factory work, where long hours, strict quotas, and harsh conditions were part of everyday existence. The factory floor wasn't just a place of production, it was where Soviet citizens played their role in building the nation and contributing to the grand vision of socialism. Despite the demanding work and sometimes perilous conditions, many workers felt a profound sense of pride in their contribution to the state and the collective effort of nation building. Factory life in the Soviet Union was far from easy. Workers often labored in difficult and uncomfortable conditions, where long hours were the norm and working conditions were less than ideal. Factories were typically noisy, hot, and overcrowded, with workers spending long shifts in environments where safety protocols were minimal and the risks of injury were high. The machinery was often old and poorly maintained, sometimes causing accidents, while the work itself was repetitive and physically demanding. Whether in steel mills, tractor factories, or manufacturing plants, workers were expected to meet high production quotas, often with little regard for their personal comfort or safety. In many factories, the workday could extend for up to 10 or 12 hours, with only brief breaks for meals. The long shifts were grueling, but they were seen as necessary to meet the goals of the five-year plan's ambitious economic strategies that promised rapid industrialization and the creation of a modern socialist economy. For the workers, the pressure to meet these quotas was ever present, and falling short could result in penalties or a loss of status within the factory system. But despite the grueling nature of the work, many Soviet workers developed a strong sense of camaraderie and pride in what they were doing. Even in the most difficult of circumstances, the factory workers found a deep sense of pride in their labor. The Soviet state promoted the idea that work was not just a means to survive, but a way to serve the greater good of society. Factories were the beating heart of the Soviet economic system, and workers saw themselves as key players in the creation of a new socialist order. Factory workers were often celebrated as the builders of socialism, with their labor seen as directly contributing to the success of the state. The slogan, "Labor is the most important thing," echoed throughout Soviet propaganda, and workers took this message to heart. They were proud of their role in fulfilling the grand goals of the five-year plans, and they saw themselves as contributing to the collective good. While the conditions in the factories were difficult, the idea that their work was building a better future for their children and for the socialist nation provided a sense of purpose and fulfillment. There were also incentives that helped keep morale high. Those who excelled in their work, or who exceeded their quotas, were often rewarded with bonuses, privileges, or public recognition. This recognition, whether in the form of extra pay, a special mention at the factory meeting, or an award for exemplary service, served to reinforce the workers' sense of importance and pride in their work. They weren't just cogs in a machine. They were seen as vital to the success of the nation's industrial project. The collectivist spirit permeated every aspect of factory life. The success of any individual was inextricably linked to the success of the team. Factory workers learned early on that cooperation and teamwork were essential if they were to meet the high demands placed on them. Workers often formed close-knit communities, supporting each other in ways that went beyond the work itself. If a colleague was struggling with a particular task, others would lend a hand. If someone needed help meeting their quota, their co-workers would pitch in to make sure the job got done. The sense of solidarity in the face of the daily grind was a core part of Soviet factory life. This collective effort was not just about getting the job done, it was about proving the superiority of the socialist system. Workers knew that their productivity directly affected the economic success of the state, and there was immense pressure to contribute to the collective success. The importance of meeting production targets was underscored by frequent meetings, speeches from factory managers, and propaganda that emphasized the need for each worker to do their part for the greater good. However, while the emphasis on collectivism created a strong sense of unity among workers, it also meant that individualism had little place in the factory setting. Personal desires or ambitions were often secondary to the needs of the factory and the state. The workers' role was to fulfill their duty, meet their quotas, and contribute to the state's goals, even if that meant sacrificing their own comfort or time. Despite the hardships, factory life in the Soviet Union was not all drudgery and struggle. Workers took pride in the progress they helped to create, and many found satisfaction in seeing the tangible results of their labor. Whether they were building machinery, producing consumer goods, or assembling agricultural equipment, factory workers had a direct hand in the creation of the products that fueled the Soviet economy. For many, this was a source of pride, a way of contributing to the success of the socialist project, and being part of something larger than themselves. However, the factory system was far from perfect. While the state provided basic benefits such as healthcare, education, and job security, it often fell short when it came to addressing the physical and emotional needs of the workers. The long hours, the monotonous work, and the constant pressure to meet quotas took a toll on many factory workers. Over time, the initial sense of enthusiasm that many workers felt began to wear off, as the challenges of working in a highly bureaucratic and sometimes inefficient system became more apparent. Yet, the workers of the Soviet Union persisted. They endured difficult conditions, stood in long lines for basic goods, and continued to meet the demands of their factories. In doing so, they played an essential role in the creation of the Soviet Union's industrial backbone. Despite the limitations of the system and the hardships they faced, many workers remained deeply committed to the goals of socialism and saw their work as integral to building a stronger, more self-sufficient state. Factory life in the Soviet Union was far from easy, but it was essential to the functioning of the Soviet economy. The workers who manned the factory floors were not just laborers, they were key contributors to the socialist vision of a collective, planned economy. Their work was both a duty and a source of pride. They endured difficult working conditions, long hours, and the constant pressure to meet high production quotas. But in return, they played a central role in the creation of the industrial infrastructure that the Soviet Union relied upon. While the reality of factory work in the Soviet Union was often harsh and demanding, the workers' commitment to their work and to the collective cause was undeniable. They understood that their labor was the foundation of the nation's progress and success. And though life in the factory could be grueling, the sense of pride in contributing to the building of socialism remained an important motivator. In many ways, the factory workers embodied the resilience and determination of the Soviet people, a reflection of the power of collective labor in the face of adversity. The daily grind, from factory floor to quotas. For the workers in the Soviet Union, the factory floor was not just a place to earn a living, it was where the pulse of the entire socialist economy beat. Every task, every movement, every hour of labor was dictated by a rigid system that prioritized the completion of quotas above all else. The concept of individual achievement or creativity was secondary to the primary goal, meeting production targets that were set by the state. This daily grind wasn't just about performing physical tasks. It was about navigating the intricacies of a bureaucratic system that demanded relentless efficiency and output. From the moment they arrived at the factory, workers were immersed in a system that was designed to squeeze every ounce of productivity from them. The system of quotas was the backbone of Soviet industry. These targets, which were determined by centralized planners, were set with little regard for the realities of the factory floor or the well-being of the workers. Quotas were seen as an essential tool for achieving the ambitious goals of the five-year plans, which aimed at rapid industrialization and the growth of Soviet economic power. Each worker had a specific production target to meet each day, and failure to meet that target could have severe consequences. The emphasis was on output, how much could be produced, how quickly, and with what efficiency. Whether they were assembling machines, building tractors, or producing steel, workers were expected to meet these quotas, regardless of the challenges they faced on the factory floor. For many workers, the relentless pressure of meeting these quotas became an all-encompassing aspect of their lives. The pressure didn't just come from factory managers, it came from the system itself, which valued numbers over quality and speed over careful craftsmanship. In this environment, workers learned quickly that their success wasn't measured by how well they did their job, but by how much they produced. The system placed immense importance on numbers, leaving little room for consideration of individual circumstances, needs, or the reality of the working conditions. While the quotas were a constant source of stress, they didn't always reflect the reality of life in the factories. Many workers found that the targets set by the state were unrealistic, sometimes far beyond what the machinery or available materials could produce. There were frequent shortages of raw materials, outdated equipment, and poorly maintained machinery, which made it difficult or even impossible to meet production goals. Yet, despite these obstacles, workers were expected to perform as if everything were running smoothly. This mismatch between expectation and reality forced many workers to adjust their approaches. Often, workers had to get creative to meet quotas sometimes, by cutting corners or finding alternative ways of achieving the required output. For instance, in some factories, workers would resort to using makeshift tools or parts rather than the official equipment provided. They would work longer hours, sometimes skipping breaks, in an attempt to compensate for inefficiencies in the system. In other cases, workers would use informal networks to find missing materials or spare parts. If a particular machine was broken and couldn't be fixed quickly through official channels, workers might find parts through other factories or black market sources. These unspoken networks of cooperation became vital to maintaining productivity, even though they were not officially sanctioned. The survival of the system often depended on the workers' ability to adapt and overcome the many barriers that stood between them and the quotas. The pressure to meet quotas wasn't just psychological, it also carried significant consequences. Workers who failed to meet their targets could face punishment, such as fines, docked wages, or even loss of job security. In the more extreme cases, workers could be reported to the authorities, leading to disciplinary action or, in rare cases, imprisonment. Even if a worker was able to produce a high quantity of work, the quality of that work often took a back seat to the speed at which it was produced. These punishments were especially daunting in a society where job security was critical. Without a steady job, workers faced not only financial instability, but also the potential social stigma of failure. Being publicly reprimanded for not meeting production targets could be an embarrassment that lasted long after the incident. Thus, workers learned to make compromises, putting in long hours, cutting corners, and sometimes bending the rules in order to meet the expectations set by the system. The pressure to meet quotas took both a mental and physical toll on workers. Many factory workers found themselves physically exhausted by the end of the workday. The long hours, repetitive tasks, and constant pressure to meet targets wore down their bodies. Musculoskeletal injuries, fatigue, and stress-related illnesses were common, and the lack of adequate medical care often meant that these conditions went untreated or worsened over time. Mentally, the relentless pressure to meet quotas led to stress, anxiety, and burnout. Workers often found themselves in a constant state of worry, worried about whether they would meet their targets, whether they would be punished for falling short, and whether they could keep up with the demands of the system. This mental strain was exacerbated by the fact that the workers had little control over their own working conditions. Their lives were dictated by the whims of the state and the factory managers, leaving them with little room for personal expression or autonomy. The quota system was designed to maximize production and efficiency. However, it often created a dilemma between the demands of the state and the well-being of the individual worker. The push for greater production did not account for the human cost of this labor, the physical exhaustion, the mental strain, and the sense of alienation that came with working in such an oppressive, high-pressure environment. This tension between efficiency and human well-being became one of the defining features of factory life in the Soviet Union. While workers were pushed to their limits in the name of building a stronger socialist economy, the system itself often ignored the fundamental human needs of the workers who were expected to perform. The constant pressure to meet quotas became a reflection of the larger contradictions within the Soviet system, one that sought to achieve greatness through collective effort, but which often neglected the individuals who made that effort possible. Despite the challenges, the workers of the Soviet Union endured. They adapted to the system, finding ways to meet quotas, cooperate with each other, and survive the demands of factory life. Even in the face of unrealistically high targets, poor working conditions, and mental and physical strain, Soviet workers maintained a sense of pride in their work. They saw themselves as the backbone of the nation, responsible for the success of the socialist project. The daily grind in the factory wasn't just about meeting quotas, it was about contributing to something larger than oneself. It was about enduring the hardships of the system in order to build a socialist society that promised equality and collective prosperity. For many, the factory floor became a space where they not only earned their living, but also fulfilled their role as active participants in the creation of a new world. However, the system itself often required more than human resilience could bear. The contradiction between the demands of the quotas and the well-being of the workers ultimately highlighted the inherent flaws in the Soviet economic system. flaws that, despite the workers' best efforts, could not be overcome by labor alone. The fear of the party. Navigating bureaucracy. In the Soviet Union, the relationship between workers and the party was deeply intertwined. Every aspect of life, from employment to personal freedoms, was governed not only by state policy but also by the political climate shaped by the Communist Party. The workers in Soviet factories, despite being the backbone of the economy, lived under the shadow of political control. Their success, their opportunities for advancement, and even their everyday lives could be heavily influenced by their relationship with the party and their adherence to its rules and ideology. In Soviet society, loyalty to the Communist Party was not just a matter of political belief, it was a necessity for survival. The party controlled every aspect of life, and workers were expected to align themselves with its principles, both in the workplace and in their personal lives. Whether it was through public loyalty to the ideals of socialism or through participation in party activities, workers had to demonstrate their allegiance. Any perceived deviation from the party's ideology could result in reprimands, loss of privileges, or worse. At work, party representatives were often present in factories, overseeing production, ensuring workers adhered to party directives, and ensuring that socialist ideals were being followed. These party members were not just political overseers. They were part of the bureaucracy that permeated every aspect of Soviet life. In many factories, the party committee would hold regular meetings, where workers were expected to show their support for the party's latest policies and plans. These meetings were not always voluntary, and missing them could be seen as a sign of disloyalty. While the party promised to serve the needs of the people, its omnipresence created an atmosphere of fear and caution. Workers were always aware that their performance at work, their relationships with others, and even their personal views could be scrutinized by party officials. The party held immense power over their careers, and any sign of disobedience or political unorthodoxy could lead to serious consequences, including job loss, denial of benefits, or social stigma. In the Soviet Union, being politically loyal to the party was more than just an ideological stance. It was a matter of survival. For many workers, demonstrating loyalty to the party was the key to securing job stability, career advancement, and social recognition. Those who were perceived as loyal to the party were often rewarded with better working conditions, promotions, and privileges. On the other hand, those who were suspected of harboring dissenting views or failing to show enthusiasm for party policies could find themselves marginalized. A worker's loyalty was often measured by their participation in party-sponsored events, such as rallies, meetings, and public demonstrations. These events were not optional. They were expected to be attended by all loyal citizens. The more fervently one participated in these events, the more likely they were to be seen as a valuable asset to the party. Even small gestures, such as wearing the red pioneer scarf, attending public celebrations of socialist achievements, or making statements that reflected party rhetoric, were seen as signs of loyalty. The party's message was clear. Loyalty meant progress. But, for many workers, maintaining this outward loyalty was exhausting and fraught with anxiety. While it was necessary to demonstrate allegiance, workers also understood the importance of keeping their personal views and criticisms hidden. Publicly disagreeing with party policies or expressing discontent was not an option. It was a path that could lead to severe punishment. Workers learned quickly to suppress their true feelings, showing outward support for the party while silently harboring private doubts. The fear of political repercussions was always present for Soviet workers. At any moment, the party could investigate an individual's actions or opinions, particularly if there was any suspicion that a worker was acting against the collective good or spreading anti-Soviet sentiment. This fear of surveillance was not unfounded. Informants were common in Soviet society, and any worker could be reported by a colleague, neighbor, or even a family member. Informants played a key role in the surveillance culture, and even the smallest deviation from party norms could be reported to authorities. This culture of surveillance created an atmosphere where workers could never be entirely sure who they could trust. While many people were genuine in their loyalty to the party, others may have been forced to conform out of fear or necessity. In this environment, the potential for betrayal was ever present. Workers who didn't adhere to the party's line could find themselves blacklisted or ostracized. The fear of being publicly reprimanded or labeled a counter-revolutionary was enough to keep most workers towing the party line, even if they privately disagreed with its policies. This silent pressure extended beyond the workplace. Social life in the Soviet Union was deeply political, and even personal relationships could be influenced by one's loyalty to the party. People learned to self-censor, avoiding topics that could lead to uncomfortable conversations or suspicion. Conversations at home, in cafes, or in the streets could quickly turn political, with workers having to be mindful of who might be listening. The consequences for being perceived as disloyal were severe, ranging from economic sanctions to imprisonment. Workers who were seen as untrustworthy, either due to political dissent or failure to meet production targets, could lose their jobs or be assigned to less favorable positions. It wasn't just about economic repercussions. There was also the social stigma that came with being branded as disloyal. Workers who were labeled as enemies of the state faced widespread discrimination. Their families could be affected too, with children often being excluded from educational opportunities and spouses facing difficulties in securing employment. Loyalty to the party, therefore, was not just about ideological commitment. It was about securing one's place in society. For many workers, their relationship with the party dictated their entire livelihood. The party's control over every aspect of life meant that their loyalty was a vital piece of their social identity. The fear of the party was not only about political repression. It was about the potential destruction of a person's life, reputation, and opportunities. In the Soviet Union, the party was not just a political entity, it was a pervasive force that influenced every aspect of a worker's life. From their job security to their social standing, everything was connected to their relationship with the party. Loyalty was not just a political choice, it was a survival strategy. The fear of the party and the necessity of maintaining a politically correct image shaped the lives of millions of Soviet workers. Navigating the party's demands was a delicate balance. On the one hand, workers had to demonstrate unwavering loyalty to ensure their survival in the system. On the other hand, they had to constantly suppress their private thoughts and concerns, knowing that even the smallest slip-up could lead to disastrous consequences. The fear of the party created an atmosphere of uncertainty and caution, where workers had to constantly monitor their words and actions to avoid suspicion. In this environment, loyalty to the party was not just a moral or ideological stance. It was the key to survival in a society where political correctness and conformity were paramount. Soviet youth, education and ideological training. From an early age, the children of the Soviet Union were indoctrinated into the values and ideals of socialism. Education was not just about acquiring academic knowledge. It was about shaping young minds to align with the goals of the Communist Party and the state. The Soviet educational system was designed to produce loyal, industrious citizens who were dedicated to the building of socialism. The ideological training was just as important as academic learning, if not more so, as the future of the Soviet state depended on instilling the right beliefs in its youth. One of the central components of Soviet youth education was membership in the pioneers. a youth organization founded in 1922 that became an essential part of a child's development in the Soviet Union. From the age of 9, children were encouraged to join the Pioneers, an organization designed to teach them about socialism, communism, and the leadership of the Soviet state, all while creating a sense of collective identity and pride. The Pioneers were often seen as the first step in a child's political education, molding them into loyal members of society who would carry the ideals of Lenin and the Communist Party throughout their lives. The Pioneers were expected to follow strict rules and participate in various activities that promoted collective values. They wore uniforms, including the distinctive red scarf that symbolized their allegiance to the state and the ideals of communism. These uniforms, worn proudly, were more than just a form of dress. They were symbols of a child's commitment to the collective and the broader goals of socialism. The uniform was a reminder that the individual was always secondary to the needs of the state. At pioneer meetings, children were taught the core values of Soviet society: loyalty to the party, the importance of collective work, and devotion to the cause of socialism. One of the central figures in their ideological education was Vladimir Lenin, the founding leader of the Soviet Union. Through stories, songs, and lessons, children learned about Lenin's life and teachings, which became the foundation of their worldview. They were taught to revere Lenin as the guiding figure of the Soviet state and to understand his role in creating the socialist system they lived under. Children also learned about the achievements of the Soviet Union, from the triumphs of the October Revolution to the successes of the five-year plans. The education system was designed to present a glorified image of Soviet life, emphasizing the progress made under socialism and the bright future that lay ahead. These lessons were presented as a way to foster pride in the Soviet system, making children feel as though they were part of something greater than themselves. Every activity in the Pioneer organization was aimed at reinforcing these values. Whether it was marching in parades, singing Soviet songs, or reading literature that glorified the party, the purpose was always the same: to deepen the loyalty of the youth to the party and its ideals. Even playtime was used to reinforce the values of teamwork and collectivism. Through games and social activities, children learned how to work together for the greater good and were taught that individualism had no place in a socialist society. Soviet schools went hand in hand with organizations like the Pioneers in shaping children into ideal Soviet citizens. The curriculum was standardized across the Union, ensuring that every child, no matter their location, received the same education that adhered to the state's ideological goals. In subjects like history, literature, and even science, the teachings were filtered through a lens of Marxist-Leninist ideology. In history classes, for example, the narrative was shaped to highlight the success of the Bolshevik Revolution, the construction of socialism, and the triumphs of Soviet leaders. Anything deemed counter-revolutionary, such as Western ideas or capitalist values, was either omitted or heavily criticized. Soviet children were taught that communism was the only true path to progress, and that any alternative ideology was backward and exploitative. They learned to view capitalism as inherently flawed and to reject Western ideas as corrupt and imperialistic. Subjects like Russian literature were similarly filtered through a Marxist lens, with a focus on works that supported socialist values or were written by authors sympathetic to the cause. Writers like Maxim Gorky and Alexander Pushkin were presented not just as great authors, but as early critics of the Tsarist system and forerunners of socialist consciousness. This approach helped to align the education system with the broader ideological goals of the state, ensuring that the youth were always exposed to content that reinforced the party's teachings. In addition to academic subjects, physical education also played a vital role in Soviet schooling. Physical fitness and military preparedness were prioritized as part of a well-rounded Soviet citizen. Boys were trained for future military service, while girls were expected to learn about the role of women in the workforce and in socialist society. Physical education was not just about fitness, it was about preparing the youth to contribute to the defense of the socialist state if needed. As Soviet children grew older, the pioneers were often the first step in a broader system of political engagement. After completing their time in the pioneers, many children would go on to join the Komsomol, the Soviet Union's official youth communist organization for those aged 14 to 28. Membership in the Komsomol was considered a rite of passage for any young Soviet citizen aspiring to contribute to the party's goals. Membership in the Komsomol was not just a recognition of loyalty. It was a way to ensure that the next generation was fully integrated into the workings of the Soviet system. As Komsomol members, young people were expected to take on roles of leadership, assist with organizing state events, and support the ideological aims of the party. The Komsomol had its own set of rules and responsibilities, and members were expected to engage in activities that promoted socialist values. It was, in many ways, a continuation of the pioneer experience, but with greater political weight and responsibility. Those who succeeded in the Komsomol had the potential to advance in the party ranks or secure high-level positions within the government or the economy. The goal of Soviet youth organizations was not just to provide children with a sense of national pride, it was to ensure conformity and loyalty to the party. By the time a child reached adulthood, they were expected to have internalized the principles of Marxism-Leninism and the values of the socialist state. They were to live according to these ideals, contributing to the collective good and ensuring that Soviet socialism would endure for generations to come. Conformity was essential, and deviation from the party line was unacceptable. The government and the party kept a watchful eye on the youth, monitoring their behavior and their beliefs. Those who strayed from the party's teachings or voiced dissenting opinions could face severe consequences, including social ostracism, exclusion from higher education, or even imprisonment. Soviet youth education was not just about learning, it was about shaping future citizens who would carry the banner of socialism into the future. Through organizations like the Pioneers and the Komsomol, Soviet children were indoctrinated into the values of the party and were taught to view themselves as vital contributors to the success of the Soviet state. The education system, combined with ideological training, ensured that the future of the Soviet Union was in safe hands, those of loyal, dedicated, and ideologically steadfast citizens who would never stray from the principles of socialism. In this way, the Soviet government sought to ensure the survival of its ideals for generations to come, with youth being the most critical element in maintaining the strength and unity of the socialist state. It was an education that not only prepared children for the workforce, but also molded their minds and hearts to serve the greater goal of the Communist Party and the socialist dream. Through the pioneers, Komsomol, and the school system, the Soviet Union sought to build a new generation, one that would continue to push forward the ideals of socialism for the benefit of the state and the collective good. The dual consciousness, living with ideology and reality. In the Soviet Union, the contrast between the official ideology of the Communist Party and the daily realities of life created what is known as a dual consciousness among its citizens. On one hand, the government and its propaganda machine promised a utopian vision of a classless, prosperous society where all were equal and the future was bright. On the other hand, the lived experience of many citizens was far removed from these lofty ideals. The everyday realities of life in the Soviet Union, from food shortages to oppressive bureaucracy and the lack of personal freedoms, painted a starkly different picture from the one portrayed in official propaganda. The Soviet state promoted an image of a perfect society, one where class distinctions were abolished. Workers controlled the means of production, and everyone contributed to the collective good. The party's narrative was that the Soviet Union had triumphed over imperialism and exploitation, and that socialism was the ultimate path to equality and progress. The promises of full employment, free education, and universal health care were constantly reinforced through propaganda in newspapers, books, films, and speeches. These messages painted a picture of a unified, prosperous society where the hardships of the past had been left behind and the future would be one of abundance and opportunity. Citizens were expected to believe in this ideal, to internalize the image of the Soviet Union as the beacon of socialist achievement and progress. They were taught to embrace the collective good over individual desires, to see their role as part of a greater movement toward global socialism. For many, this ideological framework was all they knew, and the belief in the success of socialism was deeply ingrained. The Soviet Union, as portrayed in official narratives, was a place of solidarity, fairness, and shared prosperity. However, the reality for most Soviet citizens was far different from the utopian ideals presented in party propaganda. While the government promised prosperity, many people lived in a constant state of scarcity. Consumer goods were often in short supply, and basic necessities like food, clothing, and household goods were rationed or difficult to obtain. Long lines for bread, lack of fresh produce, and shortages of even basic household items were common in many cities. The Soviet Union's centrally planned economy, despite its grand ambitions, struggled to meet the needs of its population, and this led to the everyday frustration of citizens who lived through constant shortages. Housing was another major issue. Most Soviet citizens lived in cramped communal apartments, where families shared bathrooms, kitchens, and other essential spaces. Privacy was a luxury few could afford, and personal space was nearly non-existent. The ideal of socialist construction and modern, comfortable living was not reflected in the reality of many people's living conditions. Many people lived in old, dilapidated buildings with inconsistent heating, poor plumbing, and limited access to basic utilities. Beyond material shortages, there was also the issue of personal freedom, or rather, the lack of it. Despite the promises of equality and freedom from oppression, the Soviet state maintained a tight grip on personal liberties. Political dissent was not tolerated, and anyone perceived to be opposing the government could face severe consequences, including imprisonment, surveillance, or social ostracism. The secret police, the KGB, kept a constant watch on citizens, and the fear of being reported by a neighbor or colleague created an atmosphere of suspicion and distrust. For many Soviet citizens, navigating this duality of ideology and reality was a constant mental and emotional struggle. The idealism of socialism was deeply embedded in the education system and daily life. But the reality of the system's inefficiencies, shortages, and oppressive controls led to a disconnection between the ideals people were taught to believe and the harshness of their lived experience. Workers were told that their labor was building a better future for the state, yet they worked long hours in factories, often under dangerous conditions, and received little in return for their efforts. Despite the party's assurances that the system would provide for all, many people found themselves struggling just to meet their basic needs. The political elite, who enjoyed privileges and a higher standard of living, were often the only ones who saw the material rewards of the system. Ordinary citizens, meanwhile, faced long lines for basic goods, crumbling infrastructure, and a stagnant economy. This tension between the ideal and the real led to what can be described as a dual consciousness among many Soviet citizens. On the one hand, They were forced to outwardly conform to the party's ideology, publicly celebrating the achievements of socialism, participating in party-sponsored activities, and expressing loyalty to the system. On the other hand, they quietly came to realize that the promises of the party were often empty, and that the ideal world they were taught to believe in was, in many ways, a farce. In order to survive and make sense of this duality, Soviet citizens developed coping mechanisms. In public, they wore the mask of loyalty to the party, speaking in terms of socialist progress and collective unity. In private, however, many people harbored doubts, frustrations, and even outright cynicism about the system. Informal networks of support, like barter systems for goods, became essential for many. If you couldn't buy what you needed from state stores, you would often rely on black markets or swap goods with friends and neighbors. These networks, though unofficial and often illegal, were a way for people to cope with the scarcity of resources that the state could not provide. In private conversations, people would openly criticize the inefficiency of the system, the shortages, and the corruption within the party. However, these conversations were carefully controlled. Political discussions were often conducted in hushed tones, and people knew who they could trust and who might report them to the authorities. The contradiction between what was said in public and what was said in private became a defining feature of Soviet life. People had to learn to navigate this duality, balancing the demands of the party with the practical realities of living in a society that often failed to meet its own promises. This disconnect between ideology and reality was not just a personal struggle, it was a systemic issue. The Soviet Union, in its pursuit of an ideal socialist society, had created a massive bureaucratic apparatus that was often more concerned with maintaining control and suppressing dissent than addressing the actual needs of its people. The emphasis on centralized planning, while well-intentioned, often resulted in inefficiencies and a failure to meet the needs of the population. The ideal of a classless society, for example, was undermined by the reality of a deeply stratified system where the political elite enjoyed privileges that were not available to the average citizen. The promise of a world without poverty or inequality was at odds with the everyday experience of working people, who often struggled just to survive. In the Soviet Union, the gap between what the party said and what people experienced in their daily lives was a constant source of tension. The dual consciousness that defined life in the Soviet Union was not unique to one generation or one class. It was experienced by nearly everyone, from factory workers to teachers, from farmers to intellectuals. Soviet citizens lived with the tension between the official party line and the reality of their lives. Over time, this duality became a way of life, as people adapted to the contradictions of the system. Ultimately, the dual consciousness of Soviet citizens highlights the profound gap between ideology and lived experience. It was a society where people were taught to believe in a utopian vision but were forced to confront a much harsher reality. In the end, this dissonance contributed to the gradual erosion of trust in the system. As the realities of life in the Soviet Union became increasingly difficult to ignore, the idealized image of socialism began to crumble, and the cracks in the system became more apparent to the people who had once been its most ardent supporters. The hidden hopes, dreams of a different life. In the shadow of the Soviet regime's control, where every aspect of life was shaped by state ideology, many Soviet citizens secretly nurtured dreams of a different life. Despite living in a system that demanded conformity and suppressed dissent, the desire for change and improvement never fully disappeared. While outwardly, citizens were expected to conform to the party's ideals and celebrate the successes of socialism, beneath the surface, many were quietly yearning for a life of greater freedom, better living conditions, and the possibility of a more fulfilling future. These dreams, though unspoken, were deeply felt and often found expression in hushed conversations and whispered hopes. Although the Soviet Union was a closed society, where expressing dissatisfaction with the regime could lead to serious consequences, this did not mean that people were content with their lives. While they were publicly forced to embrace the ideals of socialism, many citizens privately questioned the system's promises. There was a growing awareness that the idealized version of a classless, prosperous society presented by the party was far from the reality they faced. The shortages, the inefficient bureaucracy, the lack of personal freedoms, and the growing inequality between the political elite and ordinary citizens created a sense of disillusionment. Even in such a repressive environment, people found subtle ways to express their longing for change. The private sphere became a sanctuary for these hidden hopes. In small gatherings, behind closed doors, people would dare to dream of a world beyond the rigid confines of Soviet rule. They spoke of a life with more freedom, where their voices could be heard, where they could travel without restrictions, and where they could pursue their passions without fear of government surveillance or repression. These were not just idle fantasies, they were a form of quiet resistance to the system that demanded unquestioning loyalty and conformity. The most common way that these dreams were shared was through informal, private conversations among close friends, family members, or trusted colleagues. In the safety of a home or during breaks at work, people would engage in whispered discussions about the world beyond the Iron Curtain, expressing their frustrations and desires for change. These conversations were often framed as harmless gossip or even humor, but the underlying message was clear. The Soviet system was not the perfect society it claimed to be, and there was a yearning for something more. These conversations were an essential part of maintaining a sense of individual identity and autonomy. In a society where the government constantly monitored what people said and did, these exchanges of ideas, however small, were acts of defiance. They were moments of shared humanity, where people could openly acknowledge their dissatisfaction without fear of reprisal. Through these discussions, individuals could reaffirm their belief that they deserved better, that they were entitled to the same freedoms, opportunities, and living standards as people in other parts of the world. For many, these dreams were not merely about material wealth, they were also about personal freedom. They longed for a life where they could express their opinions without fear of being labeled an enemy of the state. They dreamed of a future where they could travel freely, where they could explore ideas without being censored, and where they could build their lives without the constant shadow of government surveillance. Despite the Soviet Union's attempts to isolate its citizens from the outside world, Western ideas and culture managed to make their way through the Iron Curtain. Books, music, films, and even news from abroad provided glimpses of a different kind of life, one where freedom of expression, economic prosperity, and personal choice were not just possible, but valued. Many Soviet citizens, especially the younger generation, became enamored with these ideals. While direct contact with the West was heavily restricted, smuggled books, illegal radio broadcasts, and Western films showed a world that was vastly different from the one they lived in. The allure of Western consumerism, the freedom of the press, and the possibility of living without the constant fear of government surveillance sparked curiosity and desire for change among many. Even simple things, like the notion of a private car, the ability to travel abroad, or the availability of consumer goods in abundance, became symbols of a life they could only dream of. These Western influences had a subtle yet profound impact on the dreams of many Soviet citizens. While they could not openly discuss their admiration for the freedoms enjoyed by people in Western countries, they often compared their own lives to what they saw in films or read in literature. The gap between the official narrative of a perfect socialist society and the reality of daily life in the Soviet Union became glaringly obvious, fueling the desire for change. While the dreams of a different life were often kept hidden beneath the surface, they were far from insignificant. Over time, these hidden hopes created a sense of shared frustration and desire for a better future. Even though it was dangerous to speak openly about wanting change, the cumulative effect of these private discussions was profound. People began to realize they were not alone in their discontent. Across the Soviet Union, there were millions of individuals quietly yearning for a life beyond the constraints of the state. The desire for a better life was not just about seeking material goods, it was about seeking dignity, freedom, and the right to live as individuals. As the years passed, this quiet resistance began to build. And while the Soviet system was able to suppress overt challenges, it could not fully extinguish the dreams of its people. These aspirations, small and hidden though they were, would eventually contribute to the growing disillusionment with the regime and the cracks in the Soviet system that became more visible as the years went on. The hidden hopes of Soviet citizens were more than just idle fantasies. They were a form of defiance in a society that demanded total conformity. While the Soviet Union's propaganda machine painted a picture of a perfect socialist society, the reality of life for many citizens was a constant struggle against the constraints of the system. But in the quiet moments of private conversation, these individuals allowed themselves to dream of a better life. These small acts of resistance, though seemingly insignificant, were part of the slow, inexorable shift that would one day challenge the very foundation of the Soviet state. In many ways, these dreams were the seeds of change. Though suppressed and hidden for years, the desire for a different life persisted. As more and more citizens began to express their dissatisfaction in private conversations, the dreams of a better future quietly laid the groundwork for the larger, public movements that would eventually lead to the collapse of the Soviet Union. The hope for a different life, for a better life, was one of the most powerful forces at play in the history of the Soviet Union, an invisible current that, over time, would lead to profound transformation. The end of an era. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked the end of an era, a monumental event that forever altered the political, economic, and social landscape of the world. For millions of Soviet citizens, the dissolution of the USSR brought dramatic change, dismantling the structures that had defined their lives for over 70 years. The grand vision of socialism that had been promised to the people, with its ideals of equality, shared prosperity, and collective progress, gave way to a new reality, one that was often more chaotic and uncertain. Yet, for all the hardship, repression, and limitations that defined life under Soviet rule, it is important to acknowledge that the Soviet experience also created a complex tapestry of memories and values that continue to shape the lives of those who lived through it. While the political system may have collapsed, the influence of the past remains deeply etched in the hearts and minds of the people. The end of the Soviet Union was not a sudden event. It was the result of years of internal stagnation, economic struggles, and mounting disillusionment. Despite the promises of prosperity and a fair, classless society, the Soviet system failed to deliver. Bureaucracy, corruption, and inefficiency had slowly eroded the foundations of the state. The people's faith in the ideals of socialism began to wane, and the government's grip on power weakened. As the economy faltered and political reform became inevitable, the Soviet Union found itself at a crossroads, unable to adapt to the changing world. When the Union finally dissolved in 1991, it left behind a fractured society. The newly independent republics that emerged from the Soviet collapse faced immense challenges, both in terms of rebuilding their economies and addressing the political void left by the collapse of the centralized Soviet state. The transition to a market economy was rough, and many former Soviet citizens found themselves navigating a world that was unfamiliar and uncertain. The hopes of the Soviet people for a better life under socialism had turned into the reality of economic hardship, political instability, and a loss of the social safety nets that had once provided security. Despite the profound changes, however, the Soviet legacy did not disappear with the fall of the regime. The Soviet people had lived through monumental struggles, from the hardships of World War II to the daily challenges of life in a society built on a command economy. They had experienced poverty, censorship, and oppression, but they had also built a sense of community and shared purpose. There was a collective strength born out of years of survival, and many Soviet citizens carried these values into the new world that emerged after 1991. The memory of Soviet solidarity, of pulling together to overcome obstacles, continues to resonate with those who lived through it. For some, the collapse of the Soviet Union was a loss of not just a political system, but of a way of life of certainty, stability, and a sense of collective responsibility. Even as they faced new challenges, many former Soviet citizens still clung to the values of hard work, loyalty, and resilience that had been instilled in them from an early age. While the Soviet Union no longer exists, the cultural and emotional ties to that era remain strong. For the generations that grew up in the USSR, the memories of Soviet life, both good and bad, remain vivid. The camaraderie of shared experiences, the sense of purpose tied to national goals, and the bonds formed in the face of adversity continue to shape how many former Soviet citizens view their past. The Soviet Union, for all its flaws and contradictions, created a strong collective identity. It was a time when people believed they were part of something bigger than themselves, working toward the greater good of society. This sense of collective effort and shared achievement cannot be erased, and for many, it remains a source of pride. The victories, such as the triumph over Nazi Germany in the Great Patriotic War or the space race, are still celebrated as symbols of Soviet strength, even as the political system that fostered them has crumbled. As the former Soviet republics transitioned into new political and economic systems, they faced the challenge of reconciling the past with the present. The experience of living under Soviet rule shaped the values, attitudes, and aspirations of entire generations. For many, the fall of the Soviet Union was not just a political event, but a cultural shift, a loss of the familiar, and the onset of an uncertain future. Yet, in the years following the collapse, there has been a growing recognition that the Soviet experience, despite its flaws, contributed to shaping modern identities. The values of hard work, perseverance, and community still resonate, especially in the face of modern challenges. Many people who lived through the Soviet era continue to carry forward these principles, finding ways to adapt to the changing world while honoring the legacy of their past. Today, as new generations grow up in a post-Soviet world, there is a sense of pride in the history and cultural achievements of the Soviet Union. The era may have ended, but the memories, stories, and lessons live on. The legacy of the Soviet Union is complex. It includes both the ideals of a utopian society and the harsh realities that came with trying to build it. Yet, for all its contradictions, the Soviet era remains an essential part of the shared history and identity of the people who lived through it. In the end, the fall of the Soviet Union was more than just the end of a political entity. It marked the end of an entire worldview. For those who lived under Soviet rule, the collapse of the system brought profound changes, both in terms of material conditions and in their sense of identity. Yet, despite the hardships and the loss of the state that had shaped their lives, many former Soviet citizens continue to carry the values and memories of their past. The collapse of the Soviet Union was not just the end of an era, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one in which individuals had to navigate a more complex and unpredictable world. However, the influence of the past remains. And for many, the end of the Soviet Union does not signal the end of their history, but the start of a new way of reconciling their legacy with the future. Thank you for joining me in exploring life in the Soviet Union through today's video. I know you're starting to sleep now. Before going to bed, if you find the video useful, please like the video and click the subscribe button. Your support is our motivation. Thank you, and see you in the next video.